The Manhattan Project proved to be a success on July 16, 1945. The shockwave from the first atomic bomb ever detonated swept from a New Mexico desert to Albuquerque, obliterating everything in its reach with heat hot enough to vaporize steel. The theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and the bomb's architects stood 32 kilometers away, watching years of work come to fruition. As the sky brightened with a fire that outshone the sun, and a mushroom-shaped cloud soared 12 kilometers into the air, the scientists knew that the secret military program to develop the atomic bomb, known as the Manhattan Project, had been successful. Oppenheimer stated, "We knew that the world would not be the same." Years after the Manhattan Project ended, he uttered the famous words, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Manhattan Project started with a letter on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's desk on October 6, 1939. The letter said, "The Nazis have made new breakthroughs in nuclear research that could lead to what they describe as extremely powerful bombs of a new type. Yours sincerely, Albert Einstein." Yes, he himself. That physics chap whose formula you well know. Einstein was not a spy, but he had a couple of friends who kept an eye on the news. In December 1938, two German scientists found by accident that uranium atoms could be split into two radioactive parts, and two scientists in the United States, Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, believed that the Germans' finding could be used to create a nuclear bomb more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. Szilard and Fermi started off by trying to develop a nuclear reactor on their own, backed only by the resources of Columbia University. But an article in the newspaper profoundly upset Szilard. He found out that Germany had seized Czechoslovakia's uranium mines and forbade the country from selling it to anyone other than the Third Reich. Szilard soon came to understand that the Nazis were developing a nuclear bomb of their own. Worried that Roosevelt would not listen to someone such as him, Szilard arranged a meeting with Einstein, shared his fears, and convinced him to sign the letter. He handed the note to Alexander Sachs, an economist and science buff who was a personal friend of the president. Roosevelt eventually agreed to meet Sachs on October 11th, a month after the news broke that Germany had invaded Poland. Roosevelt attempted to understand what the scientist was trying to say. After all, no one, apart from scientists, had ever heard of anything as earth-shattering as an atomic bomb. Finally, the president said, "What you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." This was something he could grasp. Roosevelt then sent for General Edwin Watson, handed him the papers, and ordered the Manhattan Project to begin as soon as possible. Initially, Roosevelt all but offered the Manhattan Project funding, agreeing to buy uranium and graphite for Szilard and Fermi's experiments. Not many believed that an atomic bomb was feasible. Some estimated the chances of success at 100,000 to 1. Even Fermi stated that his odds of success were remote. The biggest issue was the bomb's weight. If a nuclear bomb was even possible, a functional one would have to weigh at least 40 tons, Einstein's letter to Roosevelt said. These bombs may well turn out to be too heavy to be carried by air. Powerful as it was, the atomic bomb would do the U.S. no favors if they could not deploy it on enemy ground. The Americans were not the only ones with a nuclear program. Two German refugees in England, Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, worked hard to beat their former compatriots to the nuclear bomb, and in March 1940, made the breakthrough that would alter the project. Hey, I'm going to tell you about the secret of atomic bombs, but don't do this at home, okay? So, they found out that a large amount of uranium was needed to begin with, and then one of its isotopes had to be split off from it, specifically uranium-235. All they needed was around half a kilo or so of the isotope to build a bomb that could blow up an entire city. The energy generated by exploding such a superbomb is roughly the same as that produced by the blast of 1,000 tons of dynamite. Then it produces, for an instant, a temperature similar to that of the sun's core. The researchers also warned that a nuclear bomb would release radioactive material that the wind could scatter around the world, something they knew would be horrible. Indeed, even days after the explosion, anyone entering the affected area could die or develop cancer. Once they had figured everything out, The Manhattan Project was ready to begin. Up until then, England was the leading investor in a nuclear program. In 1943, the USA had already put its first $1 billion into the Manhattan Project, the equivalent of $15 billion today. By comparison, the British, who had been in the lead 3 years earlier, had spent only £500,000. But the two countries' projects were soon combined, as the costs were enormous. The Manhattan Project was brought to life on September 17, 1942, when General Leslie Groves was put in charge. Prior to Groves taking over the project, the scientists were battling to secure funding, as they practically had to beg. They were given a mere $90 million sum to build 4 of the planet's first nuclear power plants, and struggled to do anything with that meager amount. The atomic bomb project was given the same priority rating as a TNT factory building, and so every request they made was pushed into the background. Groves turned everything around. Within 2 days of joining the team, he spooked the administration into giving the Manhattan Project the priority of receiving the highest possible urgency whenever requested. On September 29th, 12 days after joining the team, Groves bought 56,000 acres of land in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to enrich uranium. Landowners living there were evicted from their land with little compensation, without ever knowing why. They were forced to leave and watch from a distance as their former homes became a total exclusion area, with around 80,000 employees. A public school in Los Alamos County, New Mexico was seized to create the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the bomb was to be developed. A team of the country's leading physicists was stationed there, including names such as Enrico Fermi and Richard Feynman. And heading them up was the man chosen by Groves, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is now known as the bomb's Thomas Shelby. Everything about the Manhattan Project was kept secret. The workers at Oak Ridge could not even be told what they were doing. If they asked questions, they could be fired on the spot. One worker described it this way: "When the pointer went from 0 to 100, I turned a valve. The pointer went back to 0. I would turn another valve, and the pointer would go back to 100, all day long." Security was even stricter at Los Alamos. Even Einstein and Szilard, the scientists whose letter had kicked off the Manhattan Project, were practically barred from entering. Szilard had some clearance, but Groves restricted his role. He was a German citizen and a pacifist, which made Groves extremely tense. He ordered Szilard to be dismissed from the squad, and when he failed to approve the order, had the FBI follow him wherever he went. Einstein was cut off completely. The military deemed him unfit to deal with highly secret matters related to national defense. Professor Einstein is an extreme radical, a military memo stated at the time, and Einstein was labeled a communist. Even the press was tight-lipped in its coverage. Nothing related to atomic fission was allowed in the newspapers, especially the tabloids. It was all this confidentiality, ironically, that caught the Soviet eye. In 1942, a Soviet scientist named Georgy Flyarov alerted Stalin that for 2 years the Americans had not uttered a single word about nuclear fission. His only explanation, Flyarov told him, was that they were working on the bomb. That was the start of the Soviets' espionage scheme. Einstein never managed to get into the Los Alamos National Laboratory, but Klaus Fuchs did, and reported all that he had learned to Soviet military intelligence. A couple also managed to steal the atomic bomb project and hand it over to the Soviets. On July 16, 1945, a nuclear bomb called Trinity was carried into the New Mexico desert. 6 years of research and testing later, the Manhattan Project scientists had finally created what they believed to be a workable nuclear weapon. It was now time to test it. Just in case something went wrong, the bomb was packed into a containment vessel made from 214 tons of steel, with walls 14 inches thick. If it failed, Groves and Oppenheimer thought the containment vessel would allow them to retrieve the plutonium inside safely. If it did work, the bomb would vaporize the steel. Nobody knew quite what to expect. Prior to detonating the bomb, the men from the Los Alamos National Laboratory gambled on the magnitude of the explosion. The bomb went off with a force of 20 kilotons, eclipsing all predictions. Oppenheimer is reported to have been buzzing with joy that day. The bomb was to be put into use in less than 30 days. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and only 3 days later, a second bomb was unleashed on Nagasaki. The blasts killed about 105,000 people on the first day and critically injured another 94,000. A further 100,000 died in the few months following the explosions. As far as Groves was concerned, the bombing of Japan was a triumph. In his final speech to the Manhattan Project scientists, he lauded them as heroes, saying, "You built the weapon which ended the war and thereby saved countless American lives." Not everyone agreed with his belief that this was a victory for peace. Einstein was heartbroken. Hundreds of thousands were dead, and he could not find anyone to blame but himself. "If I had known that the Germans would not be able to develop an atomic bomb," he said, "I would have done nothing." The project certainly changed the world forever. In 1949, Soviet scientists, using data stolen from the Manhattan Project, devised their own nuclear bomb, modeled after the one that fell on Nagasaki. This signaled the start of the Cold War. Even today, the world lives under the constant threat of nuclear havoc. Oppenheimer came to regret what he had undertaken. He spent the Cold War fighting for an end to the nuclear arms race, campaigning so vigorously for peace that he ended up before the House Un-American Activities Committee on charges of being a communist. "The atomic bomb was the turning of the screw," said Oppenheimer, reflecting on his legacy. "It made the prospect of a future war unbearable.